In frozen valleys and mountain forests, calm moments turn violent as unseen giants emerge from mist and hunger. Camps collapse, helicopters shudder, and even steel doors bend beneath their power. From Montana's rugged slopes to Russia's frozen borderlands, each story reveals nature's raw defiance. In this video, we'll uncover 6 chilling encounters that defy survival itself. The Absaroka Range in Montana stretched across the horizon like a jagged spine of rock and ice, its peaks dusted with early October snow that glinted under the pale morning sun. This particular wilderness area, located in the south-central region of the state, had been home to grizzly bears for centuries, serving as a critical corridor between Yellowstone and other protected habitats. The terrain was unforgiving, characterized by steep ravines, dense lodgepole pine forests, and fast-moving streams fed by glacial melt. Local rangers had long warned visitors about the concentration of grizzlies in the area during autumn, when the bears entered a state of hyperphagia, consuming up to 20,000 calories per day in preparation for their winter hibernation. Evan Clark, a 37-year-old wildlife photographer from Colorado, had arrived in the region on October 3, 2025, with plans to document the behavior of grizzlies as they prepared for their long winter sleep. Clark had built a modest reputation over the past decade for his intimate portraits of predators in their natural habitats, having previously worked in Alaska, Wyoming, and British Columbia. His colleagues described him as meticulous in his research, but perhaps overly confident in his ability to predict animal behavior. He traveled light, preferring to work alone, and often camped in remote locations for days at a time to avoid disturbing the wildlife he sought to capture. Clark had established his camp near a tributary stream known for its seasonal salmon runs. However, by early October, the fish had mostly spawned and died, leaving behind nutrient-rich carcasses that attracted scavengers. The location was approximately 8 miles from the nearest trailhead, requiring a challenging hike through dense underbrush and across unstable scree slopes. 2 hikers encountered Clark on October 4th near a forest clearing, where he mentioned he had observed several bears feeding downstream and planned to photograph them at dawn the following day. The hikers noted that Clark seemed excited but not reckless, and they watched him disappear into the timber with his pack and tripod slung over his shoulder. By October 6th, when Clark failed to check in with his emergency contact as scheduled, concern began to mount. A search team was dispatched the following morning, equipped with tracking devices and accompanied by wildlife officers familiar with the territory. The team reached Clark's campsite by mid-afternoon, and what they discovered painted a grim picture of what had transpired. His tent had been shredded, the fabric torn into long strips and scattered across the ground. His backpack lay 20 feet away, its contents strewn about: a water filter, cooking supplies, and notebooks filled with detailed observations about bear movements. Deep claw marks gouged the earth around the campsite, and drag marks led toward a thicket of willows near the stream. Investigators worked methodically to piece together the sequence of events. Based on the evidence, they concluded that Clark had likely risen before dawn on October 6th, intending to position himself near the stream to photograph bears during the optimal morning light. What he had not known, or perhaps had underestimated, was that a large male grizzly had claimed an elk carcass in the immediate vicinity. The elk, likely killed by wolves or weakened by the approaching winter, had become a prized food source, and the bear had been feeding on it for at least 2 days. Grizzlies were notoriously aggressive when defending a kill, viewing any intruder as a direct threat to their survival. Clark had apparently startled the bear while retrieving his camera equipment, possibly while moving through dense brush that obscured his view of the bear. The bear would have reacted with instinctive violence, perceiving Clark as competition for the carcass. The attack was swift and brutal. Forensic analysis of the scene suggested Clark had attempted to retreat but was overtaken within seconds. The bear's immense power, capable of delivering over 1,000 pounds of force per square inch with a single swipe, would have inflicted catastrophic injuries almost immediately. Clark's remains were located in the willow thicket, partially consumed, confirming that the bear had treated him as a food source rather than simply eliminating a threat. The incident sent shockwaves through the wildlife photography community, reigniting long-standing debates about the ethics and safety protocols of solo fieldwork in grizzly country. Friends and colleagues remembered Clark as someone who possessed both deep respect for wildlife and an almost spiritual connection to the wilderness. However, some questioned whether his confidence had crossed into complacency, a dangerous shift in mindset that wilderness professionals had warned against. The boundary between observation and intrusion was razor-thin in grizzly territory, particularly during autumn when the animals were driven by biological imperatives that overrode their usual caution around humans. Local authorities increased patrols in the area following the attack and posted additional warnings at trailheads. The bear responsible was not tracked or destroyed, as officials determined it had been acting within predictable behavioral patterns for a dominant male protecting a food source. Clark's death became a somber case study in wilderness safety courses, a reminder that nature rewards awe and careful preparation, but never tolerates assumptions or carelessness. His final photographs, recovered from a damaged memory card, showed stunning images of bears fishing and foraging, their power and grace captured in exquisite detail, a bittersweet legacy of a man who had ventured too close to something magnificent and unforgiving. Kodiak Island, located in the Gulf of Alaska, approximately 30 miles from the mainland, spans nearly 3,600 square miles of rugged wilderness characterized by volcanic mountains, dense alder thickets, and numerous salmon-rich streams. The island had earned its reputation as home to the Kodiak bear, a subspecies of brown bear that rivaled polar bears in size, with adult males occasionally exceeding 1,500 pounds. The ecosystem had remained relatively unchanged for millennia, with the bears dominating the food chain and relying heavily on the annual salmon runs that filled the island's waterways each summer. August marked the peak of the spawning season, when millions of fish fought upstream to reproduce, creating a feeding frenzy that attracted bears from across the island. Marcus O'Neill, a 41-year-old helicopter pilot from Anchorage, had been contracted by a wildlife research organization to conduct aerial surveys of salmon populations along the island's remote western coast. O'Neill had logged over 3,000 flight hours in the Alaskan wilderness, ferrying scientists, tourists, and supplies to locations inaccessible by road. His reputation centered on his calm demeanor and meticulous attention to safety protocols. However, colleagues occasionally joked about his enthusiasm for photography, which sometimes led him to make unscheduled stops in scenic locations. On the morning of August 14, 2024, O'Neill departed from a coastal staging area alone, following a predetermined flight path that would take him over several key spawning grounds. The weather remained clear but cool, with temperatures hovering around 55 degrees Fahrenheit and a light wind coming off the ocean. O'Neill had been airborne for approximately 90 minutes when he spotted a narrow gravel bar bisecting a particularly active stream where hundreds of salmon thrashed in the shallow water. The scene was spectacular, with the silver bodies of fish creating patterns against the dark stones, and O'Neill decided to land briefly for photographs. He brought the helicopter down gently on the widest section of the gravel bar, approximately 40 yards from the tree line, and shut down the rotor to reduce noise. He grabbed his camera from the passenger seat and stepped out, focusing his lens on the spawning fish. What O'Neill had failed to notice during his approach was a massive male Kodiak bear feeding in the shadows of the spruce trees bordering the stream. The bear, estimated later to weigh approximately 1,300 pounds, had been gorging on salmon for several hours and had established the gravel bar as his temporary territory. The sound of the helicopter initially caused the bear to retreat into the forest, but its hunger and territorial instincts quickly overcame its caution. As O'Neill crouched near the water's edge, adjusting his camera settings, the bear emerged from the tree line with startling speed. O'Neill spotted the movement in his peripheral vision and immediately recognized the danger. He sprinted back toward the helicopter, abandoning his camera in the gravel. His training kicked in, and he reached the pilot's door in seconds, fumbling for the ignition. The plan was to start the rotor and use the noise and movement to intimidate the approaching bear, a tactic that had proven effective in similar encounters. However, the bear was already charging across the gravel bar, its massive paws throwing up stones and water with each stride. The distance closed far faster than O'Neill had anticipated. He managed to start the rotor, but before the blades could gain sufficient speed, the bear reached the helicopter and swiped at the skids with tremendous force. The impact rocked the aircraft, and O'Neill was forced to leap from the cab to avoid being trapped inside if the helicopter tipped. He landed hard on the gravel and attempted to roll away, but the bear was already upon him. A massive paw struck his shoulder, the claws tearing through his flight jacket and into flesh. The force threw him sideways, and he crashed against a cluster of rocks, feeling his ribs crack on impact. Pain exploded through his torso and arm as the bear loomed over him, its breath hot and rank. Desperation fueled his next actions. O'Neill's right hand found the emergency flare gun attached to his belt, and he fired directly at the bear's face. The bright orange flare exploded with a sharp crack, showering sparks across the animal's snout. Simultaneously, he retrieved a canister of bear spray from his jacket pocket and discharged it in a wide arc. The combination of fire, noise, and chemical irritant finally broke the bear's aggression. The animal recoiled, shaking its massive head, then turned and loped back toward the forest, disappearing into the alders. O'Neill dragged himself toward a fallen log, leaving a trail of blood on the gravel. His radio was still clipped to his vest, and despite the excruciating pain in his ribs and shoulder, he managed to call for emergency assistance. His transmission was brief but clear, providing his GPS coordinates and describing his injuries. He remained conscious, applying pressure to the worst of the claw wounds on his arm while waiting for rescue. A Coast Guard helicopter arrived within 45 minutes, and paramedics stabilized him before transporting him to a medical facility in Kodiak. The injuries were severe but not life-threatening. Deep lacerations ran from his shoulder to his elbow, requiring over 60 stitches, and he had sustained 3 broken ribs along with extensive bruising across his back and torso. Biologists who investigated the scene later confirmed that the bear had been defending what it perceived as prime feeding territory, and that O'Neill's decision to land had inadvertently triggered a territorial response. The incident reinforced existing guidelines that prohibit pilots from landing in active bear habitat without proper reconnaissance and backup support, serving as a stark reminder that even experienced professionals can misjudge the risks inherent in Alaska's wilderness. The Ussuri-Krai region of far eastern Russia sprawled across thousands of square miles of taiga forest, its landscape dominated by towering larch and Korean pine trees that created an almost impenetrable canopy during the summer months. Located near the border with China, the territory experienced brutal winters where temperatures regularly plummeted to -30 degrees Celsius, and snow accumulated in depths that made travel nearly impossible without specialized equipment. The region had long been home to the Ussuri brown bear, a particularly large subspecies of grizzly known for its aggressive temperament and adaptability to harsh conditions. Human settlements in the area were sparse, consisting mainly of small logging communities, research stations, and isolated government outposts that served as monitoring points for illegal border crossings and wildlife movements. The Wildlife Enforcement Outpost, designated as Station 17, sat approximately 80 kilometers from the nearest village, accessible only by helicopter or snowmobile during the winter months. The structure itself was a modest affair, constructed from reinforced timber and concrete, designed to house 2 officers for rotations lasting up to 6 weeks. Sergei Ivanov, a 42-year-old wildlife officer with nearly 2 decades of experience in remote postings, had been stationed there since early January, alongside his younger colleague Mikhail Petrov, age 29. Their primary responsibilities included monitoring radio transmitters attached to tagged bears, preventing poaching activities, and maintaining communication with regional headquarters. Supplies arrived monthly, weather permitting, and included frozen meat, canned goods, and diesel fuel for the generator that provided heat and electricity. January 22, 2023, dawned with a temperature of -28 degrees and light snowfall that reduced visibility to less than 50 meters. Ivanov and Petrov had spent the morning conducting routine maintenance on perimeter sensors, motion-activated devices designed to alert them to large animals approaching the compound. The sensors had been triggering frequently over the past week, which both men attributed to increased wildlife activity driven by the severe cold. What they did not know was that a massive Russian male grizzly, estimated later to weigh over 700 kilograms, had emerged from hibernation prematurely due to disturbances in his den caused by logging operations several kilometers away. The bear was disoriented, hungry, and increasingly desperate as his body depleted the fat reserves meant to sustain him through winter. Around 2 in the afternoon, Ivanov and Petrov were outside the main structure, checking the western fence line, when they heard a deep grunting sound coming from the forest edge. Both men turned to see an enormous grizzly breaking through the snow-laden underbrush, its dark brown fur matted with ice and its breath creating thick clouds in the frozen air. The bear had been drawn to the outpost by the scent of stored rations and frozen livestock kept in an outdoor shed. Neither officer had time to retrieve their rifles, which were secured inside the building according to protocol. Ivanov shouted for Petrov to run as the bear charged toward them with shocking speed despite the deep snow. The 2 men reached the outpost door seconds before the bear arrived at the fence, but instead of stopping, the animal rammed the wooden barrier with its shoulder. The impact splintered the timber posts, sending a cascade of snow and debris into the air. Ivanov managed to slam the heavy door shut and throw the bolt, but the structure's windows rattled in their frames as the bear continued its assault. Petrov grabbed the radio and attempted to call for emergency assistance, but the transmission was garbled by static, likely due to the weather conditions. Outside, the bear had shifted its attention to the door itself, its claws scraping against the metal reinforcement plates as it tried to force entry. The noise was deafening, a combination of splintering wood, metal groaning under pressure, and the bear's furious vocalizations. Ivanov assessed their options quickly and determined they needed to create enough noise and disruption to drive the animal away before it breached their defenses. He instructed Petrov to shove a heavy filing cabinet against the door while he gathered flares and metal tools they could use to create loud sounds. Both men began banging steel rods against pipes and walls, creating a cacophony that echoed through the small building. Ivanov also ignited 2 emergency flares and tossed them through a side window, hoping the bright light and acrid smoke would deter the bear. For several minutes, the strategy appeared to be working. The bear retreated slightly, circling the building and testing different entry points. However, hunger and aggression overrode the animal's caution, and it returned to the main door with renewed determination. The filing cabinet began to slide backward as the door buckled under repeated impacts. Petrov braced himself against the cabinet, using his full body weight to hold it in place, while Ivanov fired their emergency gun through the window, hoping the sound would create enough fear response to drive the animal away. The bear broke through during one final massive charge. The door splintered inward, and the filing cabinet toppled sideways. Ivanov attempted to position himself between the bear and Petrov, brandishing a metal chair as an improvised weapon. The bear swatted the chair aside and lunged forward, its massive paw connecting with Ivanov's chest and slamming him against a wooden desk. The impact crushed several ribs, and the bear's claws opened deep wounds across his torso. Petrov grabbed a wooden beam that had fallen during the breach and struck the bear's flank repeatedly, screaming to draw its attention away from his colleague. The commotion finally attracted the attention of a passing patrol helicopter that had been searching for the source of the distorted radio transmission. The pilot spotted the damaged outpost, and the bear threw a break in the snowfall and descended rapidly, using the rotor wash and loudspeaker to frighten the animal. The combination of the helicopter's noise and Petrov's continued defense efforts finally drove the bear back into the forest. Ivanov lay critically injured, bleeding heavily from multiple wounds. Petrov administered first aid as best he could, applying pressure to the worst lacerations and wrapping Ivanov in thermal blankets, but the older officer's injuries were too severe. He died before the helicopter could land and extract them. Petrov survived the attack with significant claw wounds across his arms and shoulders, along with psychological trauma that required months of treatment. Investigators who examined the scene later determined that the bear had acted opportunistically, driven by starvation after prematurely emerging from hibernation. The attack became a sobering case study in wildlife management protocols and the dangers faced by personnel in isolated postings, highlighting how even well-trained officers could find themselves vulnerable when confronting desperate apex predators in their own territory. Kodiak Island's western coastline presents a dramatic landscape where volcanic mountains descend sharply to meet the Gulf of Alaska, creating a network of fjords, tidal rivers, and rocky beaches that serve as critical habitat for both marine and terrestrial wildlife. The region's rivers became highways for millions of salmon each summer, drawing brown bears from across the island to feast on the nutrient-rich fish. Dense fog banks rolled in from the ocean nearly every morning during June, reducing visibility to mere feet and creating an atmosphere of eerie isolation that experienced guides learned to respect. The combination of poor visibility, abundant wildlife, and treacherous tidal currents made the area simultaneously beautiful and dangerous for anyone venturing into its wilderness. Ethan Lawson, a 34-year-old adventure guide from Washington State, had been working on Kodiak Island for 6 seasons, leading kayaking expeditions and wildlife observation tours for paying clients. His reputation rested on his extensive knowledge of bear behavior and his cautious approach to wilderness travel, qualities that had earned him contracts with several research organizations seeking documentation of salmon run patterns. On June 17, 2025, Lawson had departed from a coastal staging area alone, paddling a single-person kayak equipped with research gear and multiple cameras. His objective was to film the movements of tidal salmon along a remote river mouth where freshwater and saltwater met, creating unique feeding opportunities for bears. The morning arrived, shrouded in thick fog, reducing the world to shades of gray, with visibility fluctuating between 10 and 30 feet, depending on wind patterns. Lawson had considered postponing the trip, but ultimately decided to proceed. reasoning that the fog would dissipate by mid-morning as temperatures rose. He paddled steadily for approximately 90 minutes, following GPS coordinates to reach the designated research location. The river appeared as a dark ribbon cutting through the pale mist, its surface disturbed by countless salmon struggling upstream against the current. The sheer number of fish was remarkable, their backs breaking the surface in rhythmic patterns that created a sound like heavy rain on water. Lawson beached his kayak on a gravel bar near the river mouth and stepped carefully onto the stones, mindful of maintaining his footing on the slick surface. He retrieved his primary camera and began filming the salmon run, focusing on the patterns of movement and the occasional predatory strike from seals that had followed the fish upstream. The fog distorted both sound and sight, dampening the normal indicators of nearby wildlife. Lawson remained alert but focused on his work, checking his surroundings every few minutes while adjusting camera angles to capture optimal footage. He had been filming for approximately 20 minutes when movement in his peripheral vision caused him to freeze. A massive Kodiak bear emerged from the foggy tree line roughly 40 yards upstream, its enormous bulk materializing like a ghost from the gray mist. The bear was a mature male, its shoulder height easily exceeding 4 feet, with a coat of dark brown fur that appeared almost black in the diffused light. For several seconds, neither Lawson nor the bear moved. The animal's head swung in his direction, and even through the fog, Lawson could see its eyes lock onto him with unmistakable focus. The bear's posture shifted subtly, its weight moving forward onto its front legs in what Lawson recognized as a precursor to a charge. He began backing slowly toward his kayak, moving in careful increments while keeping his eyes on the bear. His mind raced through the protocols he had taught countless clients: avoid sudden movements, speak calmly, appear large but not threatening. However, the fog's distortion made it impossible to judge the distance between them accurately, and Lawson realized too late that the bear had already begun moving. The charge happened with terrifying speed. The bear exploded forward, its massive paws throwing up gravel and water as it crossed the shallow river in great lunging strides. The fog created a nightmarish effect, with the animal appearing and disappearing in swirling patches of mist. Lawson abandoned any pretense of calm retreat and sprinted toward a fallen log that lay partially across the gravel bar, a massive piece of driftwood deposited by winter storms. He scrambled onto the log's slick surface, his boots struggling for purchase on the weathered wood, his heart hammering so violently he could hear his pulse in his ears. The bear reached the riverbank and continued its charge across the remaining distance. Lawson had seconds to react. His right hand found the emergency flare gun secured in his vest pocket while his left grabbed the canister of bear spray attached to his belt. He fired the flare first, the projectile shrieking through the fog and exploding in a burst of red light that momentarily illuminated the scene with hellish clarity. The bear flinched, but did not stop. Lawson discharged the bear spray in a wide horizontal arc, creating a cloud of chemical irritant that hung in the damp air. The combination of fire, noise, and burning spray finally broke the bear's momentum. The animal skidded to a halt less than 15 feet from the log, its massive head shaking violently as it tried to clear the irritant from its nose and eyes. It released a sound somewhere between a roar and a cough, then wheeled around and crashed back into the forest, disappearing into the fog as suddenly as it had appeared. Lawson remained frozen on the log for several minutes, his entire body trembling from adrenaline, his breathing coming in ragged gasps that sent clouds of vapor into the cold morning air. When he finally climbed down from the log, he discovered deep bruises forming along his ribs and arms, where he had collided with the wood during his scrambling ascent. His left hand bore several scratches from the bear's claws during the final moments of its charge, though he had no memory of the contact occurring. He abandoned his camera equipment and paddled back to the staging area, fighting against both the current and the shaking of his muscles. Medical personnel who examined him later confirmed the claw scratches and treated his bruises, noting that his injuries could have been catastrophically worse. Biologists who reviewed Lawson's report concluded that the bear had been defending prime fishing territory and perceived his presence as a direct threat to its food source. The fog had prevented either party from detecting the other until they were dangerously close, eliminating the gradual awareness that typically allowed bears and humans to avoid confrontation. The incident reinforced existing warnings about solo travel in poor visibility conditions. It highlighted how even experienced guides could find themselves in life-threatening situations when environmental factors compromised normal safety protocols. Lawson returned to guiding work the following season, but never again ventured into foggy conditions alone. The Appalachian Trail spans over 2,000 miles of wilderness, connecting Georgia to Maine through some of eastern North America's most rugged and remote terrain. The section running through the southern mountains featured dense hardwood forests, steep elevation changes, and isolated stretches where hikers might travel for days without encountering other people. By early October, the summer crowds had thinned considerably, leaving the trail to dedicated long-distance hikers and those seeking solitude among the autumn colors. Black bears inhabited much of the trail corridor, typically avoiding human contact unless habituated to food sources or surprised at close range. Wildlife management agencies had struggled for decades with the problem of food-conditioned bears. These animals had learned to associate human presence with easy meals from improperly stored supplies or carelessly discarded garbage. Hannah Yates, a 19-year-old college student from Virginia, had embarked on a solo section hike in early October 2018, planning to cover approximately 60 miles over 5 days before returning to her studies. Yates was an experienced backpacker despite her young age, having completed numerous shorter trips with family and school groups. Friends described her as cautious and well-prepared, the type of person who studied trail guides thoroughly and carried proper safety equipment. She had informed her parents of her itinerary, providing specific shelter locations where she planned to spend each night, and had promised to check in by phone whenever she reached areas with cellular service. Yates began her hike on October 4th, entering the trail at a remote access point and heading north through territory characterized by dense oak and hickory forests, interspersed with thickets of rhododendron. The weather remained mild, with daytime temperatures in the low 60s and clear skies that provided excellent visibility. Her first 2 days passed without incident, and she managed to send a brief text message to her mother from a ridgetop, where she caught minimal signal. The message mentioned beautiful fall colors and good hiking conditions, but included nothing suggesting trouble or concern. On the evening of October 6th, Yates reached a backcountry shelter located approximately 8 miles from the nearest road access. These 3-sided wooden structures were spaced along the trail at intervals, providing basic protection from the weather and designated camping areas. Yates arrived to find the shelter unoccupied, a common occurrence during weekday travel in autumn. She prepared dinner using her portable stove, hung her food bag properly from a designated bear cable, and settled into her sleeping bag as darkness fell. Her journal entry for that evening, discovered later by search teams, mentioned hearing something large moving through the underbrush near the shelter around 9 in the evening. She wrote that she had banged her metal cooking pot and shouted to scare the animal away, assuming it was a curious black bear investigating the area for food. The following night, October 7th, Yates chose to camp several miles beyond the next designated shelter, selecting a flat area near a small stream where she could refill her water supply. This decision, although not inherently dangerous, placed her in a location where other hikers were unlikely to pass by. Her journal entry from that evening revealed growing concern. She described a black bear approaching her tent around dusk, circling her campsite despite her attempts to appear threatening by standing tall and making loud noises. She noted that the bear seemed unusually bold, showing little fear of her presence. Eventually, the animal had wandered away, but Yates admitted in her writing that she felt uneasy and had considered hiking out early the next morning. October 8th brought what would be Yates's final journal entries. The handwriting showed signs of stress, with words occasionally crossed out or written with visible pressure on the page. She documented the same bear returning to her campsite in mid-afternoon while she was filtering water from the stream. The animal had approached within 20 feet before she managed to drive it off by throwing rocks and screaming. Yates wrote that the bear's behavior was abnormal, that it seemed to be following her along the trail, and that she planned to hike through the night if necessary to reach a road crossing where she could get help. Her final entry, timed around 6 in the evening, stated simply that the bear had returned and was circling her tent. The entry ended mid-sentence. When Yates failed to check in on October 9th as promised, her parents contacted park authorities. A search team was dispatched the following morning, starting from the last known location Yates had mentioned in her text message. Searchers followed the trail north, checking each shelter and likely camping location along the route. They discovered her abandoned campsite late on October 10th, approximately 12 miles from the nearest road. The scene immediately indicated a violent encounter. Her tent had been torn open, the fabric shredded by claws, and her supplies were scattered across a wide area. Claw marks scored the trees surrounding the campsite, and drag marks led into dense underbrush. The search team followed the trail of disturbed vegetation and discovered Yates's remains approximately 300 yards from her campsite. The bear had partially consumed her body and attempted to cache the remains under leaves and debris, a behavior typical of black bears defending a food source. Rangers located the bear the following day, observing it from a safe distance before determining it needed to be destroyed. The animal showed no fear of human presence, approaching the rangers boldly and displaying aggressive posturing. After the bear was put down, examination confirmed it was an adult male showing signs of previous human contact, likely a result of years spent scavenging from careless campers. Yates's journal, recovered from her scattered belongings, provided crucial details about the bear's escalating behavior over multiple days. Wildlife biologists who reviewed the case determined that the bear had become food conditioned, learning to associate human campsites with readily available food. The animal had likely been following Yates along the trail, viewing her as a potential food source rather than a threat. The journal entries documented textbook escalation patterns that should have prompted immediate evacuation. However, Yates may not have recognized the severity of the situation due to her relative inexperience with predatory bear behavior. Her death led to sweeping changes in trail management across several states. Authorities strengthened food storage rules by installing bear-proof containers and launching safety education programs on recognizing bear behavior. Warning signs at trailheads advised hikers when to turn back rather than risk encounters with food-conditioned bears. The site became known as the Yates Stretch, a quiet memorial to her respect for solitude and the dangers of the natural world. Her story became required reading in wilderness safety courses, a sobering reminder that even preparation and caution can't always protect against wildlife shaped by human carelessness. The Arctic ice shelf stretched endlessly in all directions, a frozen desert of pressure ridges, wind-sculpted drifts, and vast flat expanses where snow and sky merged into an indistinguishable white void. Located approximately 400 miles north of the Canadian mainland, this region served as a critical research zone for glaciologists, studying the effects of climate change on ice thickness and stability. Winter temperatures routinely dropped below -40 degrees Celsius, and storms could materialize with terrifying speed, trapping researchers for days in whiteout conditions. Polar bears roamed the ice shelf constantly, following seal populations and establishing temporary territories based on hunting success. The bears' reliance on sea ice for hunting meant that lean seasons, when seal populations declined or ice conditions prevented successful hunts, could drive the animals to desperate measures in their search for calories. Leah Anders, a 31-year-old glaciologist from Norway, had been working in Arctic research for nearly 7 years, specializing in ice core analysis that provided historical climate data. She had arrived at the remote research station in early March 2020 as part of a 4-person team conducting a comprehensive survey of ice thickness across a 200-square-mile area. The work required traveling long distances across unpredictable terrain using specialized tracked vehicles known as snowcats, which provided both transportation and a degree of protection from the extreme cold and wildlife. On March 11th, Anders had departed from the base station alone, following an approved route to a designated core sampling site approximately 30 miles to the northwest. The morning weather appeared manageable, with temperatures around -35 degrees and moderate winds that kept visibility acceptable. Anders piloted the snowcat methodically across the ice, navigating around pressure ridges and areas where the ice showed signs of instability. The vehicle's heated cab provided a stark contrast to the lethal cold outside, and Anders monitored the instrument panels, which showed engine temperature, fuel levels, and GPS coordinates. She had been traveling for roughly 90 minutes when fog began rolling across the ice shelf, reducing visibility from several miles to less than 50 yards within minutes. The mist was a peculiar Arctic phenomenon, created when relatively warm air masses collided with the frozen surface, transforming the landscape into a disorienting maze of white shapes and shadows. Anders reduced her speed and continued forward, relying heavily on GPS navigation while keeping alert for obstacles that might damage the snowcat's tracks. She was approximately 2 miles from her destination when movement ahead caught her attention. A shape materialized from the fog, large and pale against the white background. Within seconds, Anders recognized the distinctive profile of a male polar bear standing atop a pressure ridge roughly 100 yards ahead. The bear's head swung in her direction, and even at that distance, Anders could sense the animal's focus shifting entirely to her vehicle. Polar bears were apex predators with no natural enemies and little inherent fear of unfamiliar objects. This particular bear, later estimated to weigh over 600 kilograms, appeared gaunt despite its size, with visible hollows along its flanks suggesting an extended period without successful hunting. The seal season had been unusually poor that winter, with ice conditions preventing normal hunting patterns, and biologists had reported increased bear aggression in the region as animals struggled to find adequate food. Anders recognized the danger immediately and accelerated the snowcat, intending to maintain distance while the bear hopefully lost interest. The bear responded by charging down the pressure ridge and across the flat ice directly toward her vehicle. The speed was remarkable, the animal's massive paws finding purchase on the slick surface as it closed the distance in great bounding strides. Anders pushed the throttle to maximum, but snowcats were designed for stability rather than speed, and the vehicle's top velocity was barely 12 miles per hour. The bear gained ground rapidly, its pale form growing larger in her mirrors as the fog swirled around them both. The impact came suddenly and with tremendous force. The bear reached the snowcat and launched itself at the vehicle's side, its massive paws striking the tracked drive system with enough power to jolt the entire cab. Anders was thrown against the dashboard, her shoulder striking the instrument panel with a sickening crack. Pain exploded through her upper body as her collarbone fractured. The bear continued its assault, clawing at the tracks and attempting to gain purchase on the vehicle's exterior. Each impact sent vibrations through the cab, and Anders heard the shriek of metal being torn and bent. She fumbled for the emergency controls, her right arm nearly useless from the shoulder injury. Her left hand found the panel containing flares and the external horn system. She triggered 3 flares simultaneously, their bright magnesium flames erupting from launchers on the snowcat's roof and falling around the vehicle in a circle of intense light and smoke. The horn blared continuously, its sound distorted and amplified by the fog. The bear continued attacking for several more seconds before finally backing away, its attention divided between the vehicle and the burning flares, scattered across the ice. Anders maintained pressure on the horn while accelerating away from the scene, leaving the confused and increasingly agitated bear behind in the fog. She managed to travel another mile before the combination of pain, shock, and adrenaline crash forced her to stop. She radioed back to the research station, her transmission broken by sharp intakes of breath, as broken bones ground together with each movement. The injury assessment was grim. Fractured collarbone, deep bruising across her torso where she had struck the dashboard, and lacerations on her arms where she had braced against the controls during the impacts. The rescue team reached her position 4 hours later, navigating through the fog using GPS coordinates from her emergency beacon. They found Anders conscious but hypothermic. The snowcat's heater was struggling to maintain an adequate temperature after the bear's attack had damaged the exterior panels. Medical personnel stabilized her injuries and transported her back to the station, then evacuated her to a hospital facility via helicopter once weather conditions improved. The injuries required surgical intervention to repair the fractured collarbone and weeks of recovery before she regained full mobility in her shoulder. Wildlife biologists who reviewed the incident noted that polar bear attacks on vehicles, while uncommon, had increased in frequency as climate change disrupted traditional hunting patterns. Starving bears would investigate any potential food source, and cars could trigger predatory responses if the animals perceived movement or detected fuel or food odors. The encounter underscored the limitations of mechanized protection in isolated polar environments, where even substantial vehicles offered no guarantee of safety against desperate apex predators. Anders eventually returned to Arctic research, but never again traveled alone, and her case became part of mandatory safety briefings for all personnel working in polar bear territory.